Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one of the things that is happening in the world, that's been happening for decades now, is what is being called the Great Dechurching. If you've been a listener to this podcast, we did an interview with the author, Michael Graham, along with David French, where we had to come to grips with the fact that we are in the midst of the largest and fastest religious shift in U.S. history, with some 40 million Americans, that's 1 in 6 Americans, having stopped going to church in the past 30 years. So that's the Great Dechurching. And in that podcast, we talked a lot about what's happening for adults and how much just adult lifestyles and consumer sort of mentality has been changing in substantial ways Americans' attitudes towards church, along with some dynamics like politicization, like abuse, and so forth. So all of it is happening for adults. It's also happening for youth. And that's what we're talking about today, is the Great Dechurching of youth. And I have the privilege of who I think is one of the preeminent experts on this subject, Kara Powell. Kara, welcome to the Good Faith. Welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. It's wonderful to be with you and your listeners again.
Kara is the Chief of Leadership Formation at Fuller Seminary, an institution I'm associated with. Also the Executive Director of the Fuller Youth Institute and Professor of Youth and Family Ministry. So, Kara, let's just get right into it. What is the numbers telling you about the Great Dechurching of American youth?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, Curtis. And generally, I'm an optimist. I'm a glasses half full person. But it's hard to be that way when we look at what's happening with young people. So according to the Great Opportunity Report by the Pine Tops Foundation, over 1 million young people a year are leaving the faith. If you look at kind of a compilation of studies, we think that about 40 to 50% of graduates from great youth groups, probably like represented by your listeners, great families like your listeners, drift from faith and the faith community after they graduate. So the same kind of drifting that we're seeing in adult generations, we're certainly seeing with young people. And, I imagine for all of us, these aren't just statistics. This is personal. For many listeners, it's your kid, your stepchild, your grandchild, a young person you were close to in your neighborhood, in your church. So I rarely, if ever, meet an adult who can't point to a young person they care about deeply, who's drifted from the faith. So I'm glad we're having this conversation today.
Yeah, I think it's important to name that from the outset of just the emotional pain.
Yeah.
This is not an abstract demographic statistic. Like you said, it's our kids, it's our relatives, it's our friends' kids. And it's important to name this is happening everywhere, because if we don't name that reality, then we shift into this individual narrative that thinks it's just us. It must be something I did wrong. And we kind of keep that hidden, and there's all this shame. Are you seeing that when you talk with parents, that there's this sort of shift into this individual self-recrimination, or just you don't want to talk about it because you're embarrassed to admit your kid is no longer following Jesus actively as you are talking with people in your church community?
Yeah. Well, gosh, I wish it's like you eavesdropped on my conversation with my husband this morning, Curtis, because our 3 kids are 23, 21, and 17. And we thank our Lord that they're all following Jesus right now and connected to a local church. And we think that's great. And with one of our kids this morning, I was saying to my husband, gosh, I wish we had done something different in parenting 3 years ago. As that I think would have just been better for that child. And so, I'm constantly evaluating myself. What could we do better, differently to learn? And I don't think that's a terrible thing for parents to do. And you're right that this isn't just so much about individual kids. It's about a mass movement that we're seeing of young people viewing the church as irrelevant, feeling relationally disconnected from the church. I mean, the good news, I am an optimist. So, I will say that Springtide Research Institute did some interesting data a year into the pandemic. For 13 to 25-year-olds, only 10% of 13 to 25-year-olds in the U.S. had heard from a faith leader during the first year of the pandemic, which to
Wow.
me is terrible. Yeah, thanks for saying wow to that. I don't know if I'm more sad or mad about that, but I feel
That's amazing.
both.
Yeah.
Yeah, only 10% of 13 and 25-year-olds heard from any faith leader, not just Christian, but Islamic, Jewish, Mormon. That's the bad news. Here's the good news, though, is that 70% of those same 13 to 25-year-olds said they have a new openness and appreciation for relationships.
Yeah.
So we feel like now, yes, young people are drifting, and now is a window, I'll even say a divine window. If you look at what's happening with young people's mental health, if you look at what's happened with their openness to relationships, like this is the time for caring, Jesus-centered adults to invest in the young people we care about most.
Okay, so let's tease out the why this is happening
Yeah.
a bit. So I think every individual parent probably has, who has a child who has left the faith, does need to do some evaluation,
Yeah.
not for recrimination or
Sure.
for blame,
Sure.
but for thinking, what do we do now, right? But
Sure.
let's bracket for a moment
Yeah.
the individual lens.
Yeah.
Let's broaden out to the societal lens.
Yeah.
I think again, I think that's important for every parent to realize you're swimming against a huge current.
Yeah.
But let's try to name the current. What are the different forces in play that are driving you away from church?
The different waves in the current, so to speak, if we're going to continue with the metaphor.
Wave after wave
yeah,
after wave.
Exactly. Well, one, I think the Springtide data shows that young people don't feel relationally connected to adults. And that might be the most important thing that I would highlight in this whole conversation. I was asked recently, for all the research of the Fuller Youth Institute, if you were to summarize it in one sentence, what would you say? And my off-the-cuff summary, which actually I haven't amended, it still works for me, is really faith formation boils down to caring, Jesus-centered adults investing in young people. And so, I'd say the biggest wave is that that's not happening in mass like it needs to. There are some other waves, though. And actually, Curtis, I'd love to use the words of actual young people. One, a 13-year-old who told her youth pastor dad recently, "Why should I tell others I'm a Christian? Christians are jerks." And I think young people see the church and Jesus followers as unkind. They have seen us in a lot of conflict, a lot of dissension, internally, as well as how we engage with our world broadly. And that's off-putting. They don't see us as hospitable, or kind, or loving. So that's one quote from a young person. Then if I could point to one other wave, a 15-year-old said recently to us, "I'm tired of the church answering questions I'm not asking." I'm tired of the church answering questions I'm not asking. And so I think there's a wave of irrelevance that the church doesn't seem to care about what young people care about, isn't asking the questions that are most prevalent for them. So lack of relational support fundamentally exacerbated by a wave of unkindness and a wave of irrelevance.
Okay. I want to get back to the relational issue because I think that is, like you said, is the big highlight of your findings, of I think what you're trying to do now. And I think it's important for us to unpack why there's been the lack of relational support. So let me bracket that. But I want to just zero in quickly on the second point you raised, which is that youth are turned off by what they perceive as either their parents directly or their parents' generation of their attitudes as representative of Christianity. That they're looking at their parents or their parents' generation saying, if that's Christianity, I don't want to have anything to do with that. And I just want to quote this statistic from the Great Dechurching. It said that 68, and I quoted this in the past, but I want to, it's such an important statistic. 68% of dechurched evangelicals said their parents played an important role in their decision to dechurch. Okay, so it's almost 77 in 10 dechurched evangelicals said their parents played a role in their decision. Now, what's important is that I think there will be things we need to unpack about how parents related to them, but the biggest reason they're citing is the modeling. They saw in their parents. And here were the five things that they cited as the biggest factors in their parents. One, their emphasis on culture war lost me. That was the number one reason for why these dechurch evangelicals said their parents impacted them. That their parents' emphasis on culture war lost me. Number two, they perceived a lack of love, joy, and generosity. So they're saying, wait, I'm not seeing what you're telling me enacted in your own lives.
Yeah.
Number 3, their inability to listen. Right. So
Mm.
this is a little bit
Phew.
your point about you're telling me things that aren't, you're giving me answers I'm not even asking. Right. So their inability to listen. Number 4, inability to engage other views. So not only not listening to me, but listening to other voices that I care about in the world. And number 5, the racial attitudes that they perceive. Right. So does this ring true to both your findings and your anecdotal sort of impression of what's happening in the landscape?
Absolutely, Curtis. I mean, those were very insightful, and each one was convicting, I think, because I think about myself and Jesus followers and parents in general, that we tend to be more known by what we're against than what we're for.
Yeah.
And this generation is a generation that really wonderfully values being loving, being accepting, and they perceive us as being closed-minded and being judgmental toward them and people and causes that are close to them. And so, and that's exacerbated, I think, by this generation's overall distrust in institutions, right? And so we have our work cut out for us in rebuilding relationship and rebuilding trust. I saw some data recently, also from Springside, that young people are twice as likely to say that they've been hurt by organized religion as to trust organized religion.
That's right.
For all 5 reasons that you gave. And so I love the Stephen Covey phrase that we can move at the speed of trust.
Yes. Yeah.
Just in general. And so, a parent's relationship with a child or stepchild and a church's relationship with the next generation, it really starts with building trust. And we do that through listening, through showing we care, through showing that we remember what's important to them. So those 5 reasons definitely resonate with me.
Well, and I think what it points to, again, is that we have to really counter our instinct that there's some program out there that's going to be the magic bullet here.
Yeah, totally.
It's like, hey, we need to do something to the youth in order to get them back to the church. That's the mentality. And what all the data is saying, no. You need to start with, and I like that, it's move with the speed of trust. And I also say it's move at the speed of self-transformation. Right? So you need the trust to understand more why they are being turned off, realizing that you need to build enough trust so that they can say, it's actually because what I see either in you or your friends or your generation. And then the next step after building that trust to hear their perspective, their critique, is to be willing to say, actually, rather than importing in an external program that will run to solve it, which may be part of the toolkit you need, it needs to begin with self-transformation, because actually they are not seeing a life of following Jesus that they're attracted to. And so we have to transform ourselves as parents and look in the mirror. And so that, Kara, give me some examples of where you've seen parents doing that and actually that building both trust and interest among youth. Young people.
Well, specifically when you talk about the example of parents, I mean, I tell parents, the good news is we don't have to act more spiritual than we are. We just need to invite our young people into our spiritual journey. And in some of our research we've done at the Full Youth Institute for a new book called Faith Beyond Youth Group, we specifically looked at what kind of modeling, whether it's a mentor or a parent, is meaningful to young people. And I was surprised in the data at how much young people wanted to know how adults close to them were experiencing Jesus in the midst of the tough times, in the midst of the struggles, in the midst of the doubts they had about faith. I had a tough personnel situation at my work at Fuller Seminary recently. And I thought, my kids are old enough, without getting into a lot of details, I just wanted them to know that this was something I was navigating. So I just shared about it with them. And interestingly, multiple times my kids have asked me, Mom, how's it going with that situation at work? Like the fact that I shared a struggle and how I was trying to journey through it, how I was trying to pastor in the midst of it, be a good boss, etc. Like they so They asked me more follow-up questions about that than anything like positive or victorious that I shared
Yes.
recently in my life. And so I think young people, they want to see the real us. And they want to know too, like, what questions do we have about faith? I think about all we're hearing about deconstruction.
Yeah.
And young people are asking really good questions about faith, and adults are asking really good questions about faith. And so I think it's really healthy for a family to talk openly about what new questions are we wondering about God and what it means to follow Jesus these days, and to let that be an ongoing topic. One of the ways that I like to do that with my kids is to ask them, what do you now believe about God and faith that you think I don't believe?
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And what do you no longer believe about
Yeah.
God and faith that you think I do believe?
Right.
Which is admitting our faith is going to change, it's going to grow, and our faith is going to be different from each other's.
I love that question, because it is then you're again expressing the reality that we are following Jesus. We are not in a static position of holding some beliefs and truths and precepts that we are then saying, you must check the box and subscribe to this. But we're in a dynamic relationship with following Jesus, which means change, which means we are leaving behind some old beliefs, adopting some new ones. I really love your sort of encouragement to give parents a window into your own lives. And I want to actually just do this as partly as a plug, but it's speaking to what the data, because again, the number one reason why de-churched evangelicals say their parents played a role is their emphasis on culture war lost me over time, which means if you want to speak to your kids, give them some window into how you are engaging with politics and the culture war in a way that shows openness, that shows change. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is David French, Russell Moore, and I are releasing the After Party Project.
I've already signed up, Curtis.
Oh, thank you.
I'm super
Awesome.
excited. Yeah. I think it's such a great idea.
Well, so we're rolling this out in Ohio right now. So if you're any parents are listening to this in Ohio, what I really want to encourage you is tell your youth you're going through this. It doesn't mean you're saying I'm changing my views or anything like that, but just signal, like, I recognize this is an issue. I recognize the culture and political wars are an issue in our faith. I'm open to exploring. I'm open to change. I think if you just signal that to your youth, that will signal some potential interest. Now, it might not mean they're immediately going to be like, oh, tell me everything. That's not the way young people work. But if you do it and you're like, week 1 was this, week 2 was this, week 3, there's a chance by week 4, they're like, oh, what happened last week?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Share that journey for sure. Absolutely. I think that's a great action step. Thanks for suggesting that, Curtis.
And I want to, Kara, speak to the psychological barriers that parents have to overcome to make that move of opening their spiritual lives to their kids, because I think this is where parents, I know this is true for me. I have to confess that I use the excuse of, I want to give them room. I want to give them space. And I realize that there's some truth to that. Like, you don't want to be invasive and come in with guns blasting and asking all these questions. But I realized that that's actually an excuse at some level to not do the hard work of sharing my own lives with them. Right? Because it's different for me playing inquisitor into their spiritual lives. That's where you need to give the space. But I realized I've used that to just like completely not share vulnerably about my own spiritual lives. So speak about these kinds of psychological mental shifts that parents have to take.
Yeah. So, I think what's interesting is that people in general tend to have two different tendencies, to overshare or to undershare. And I think the typical parent undershares. And so, this is a good question to talk about with close friends. Do I overshare or do I undershare? I think most of us, and I'll put myself in this category, we undershare because we're so focused on, before your kid drives, you're focused on getting them to soccer practice and, what they need for school. And then once your kid's driving, you're focused on so many other things that it's easy to let that emotional intimacy slide.
Yes.
And so, I would say have rhythms that work for mutual sharing based on the age of your kid. And so when our kids were young, we have 3 kids. When our kids were young, we had Powell time. And what Powell time was it was one-on-one time. So this was elementary school. You know, Dave, my husband, would take 2 kids, I would take 1, or vice versa. And we had journals, and we would ask our kids questions. What are you looking for in a friend? What's your favorite thing about your teacher? You know, those sorts of things. But then we would give them a chance to ask us questions.
Oh, I love that.
Because we wanted them to start, and you know, their questions like, "What's your favorite color?" Like they weren't deep questions for an 8-year-old. But you know, we wanted that to be a pattern. When our kids were in middle school and high school, meals became so valuable, and so you know, we had different sharing routines at meals. Sometimes we would talk about how did you see God at work today, and we would all share. Sometimes we would talk about what mistake did you make today. And so that, you know, our dinner table became a place where we could talk about mistakes. So I think it's very appropriate to have structured time there. And then as our kids get older, and I just learned a great lesson a couple weeks ago, Curtis, about this. Like when your kid graduates from high school, especially, you do shift into a different relationship where you're less of a teacher and more of a guide. That's more journey alongside your young person. You're still the parent, definitely. And there's more mutuality. And so with our college daughter, I actually explained that to her 2 weeks ago. And I said, you know, now that you've graduated and you're a year into college, like we actually see that we have a different role as parents. We're not giving you consequences when you make mistakes. You know, we're not in that kind of discipline.
We're not saying there's no curfew. You can't enforce that in college.
Exactly. It's not about a curfew. It's about, hey, will you text us when you get home just so that we know that you're home? Exactly. So, and what was interesting is she said, boy, it would have been good to have heard that from you earlier.
Wow.
Because I think she was still assuming that we were going to have this parental posture that was a little bit more disciplinarian than coming alongside. And so that was a good lesson for me, that we can even talk with our kids about we're moving into a different stage. So
I love that. It's basically you're narrating for them, explaining for them what you're trying to do. And you know, that's basic in any relationship. It's basic in good management practices. Like I just had a conversation with one of my employees where I was like narrating, okay, we're moving to a different kind of relationship now because you've been promoted and I have these extra responsibilities. And I thought, wait a minute, I should be doing that with my kids. I should be saying, you know, exactly, like, okay, you're now graduated from college. What does that mean? You know, what does that mean for us? And let's not, and I'm not going to announce that unilaterally. I'm going to invite a conversation and say, what do you think it means now that you're in college, or now that you've graduated from college?
Exactly.
How do we shift our relationship? I want to name a thing that I think is a corollary to this move for parents to make to up the level of listening, conversation, self-disclosure, which is to just name the elephant in the room, which is you have to deal with the smartphone issue. Because I look around like at a dinner time in the restaurant. It is so depressing.
It's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking.
Totally.
This time that you've spent money and time for relationship, I would say, I don't know, 8 out of the 10 of the families I see, everybody's on their smartphones, including the parents.
I was just going to say the parents are often just as bad as young people, for sure.
So it just seems like you've got to face that issue head on and agree on common practices that carve out conversational space, because you're not going to have Powell time in the way that you described it if all of the Powells are scrolling on their phones, right? So, so you have to face that head on. And again, this is part of the self-transformation. You can't wag your finger and say, kids, you should be on social media less if you're on social media just as much as they are, scrolling through the things. And so, again, this is where I encourage parents to face this, read TechWise Family by Andy Crouch and other great works on there. You've got to adopt practices that everybody is agreed to and are going to hold each other accountable on this, not just as a way to limit the bad influences of smartphones, of which there are many, and of which the data is now clear. It is the leading, social media and smartphones is the leading driver of the mental health of ills facing our younger generation. So you need to limit it just to limit the bad, but it's also to open up for the good. And we've been talking about how parents need to really both address the self-transformation that's needed for their own lives of following Jesus, and then make that visible and invite youth into that, into a conversation and the various practices. Now I want to shift to churches and what they can do.
Right.
Because Kara, this is what you're trying to do with your 10 by 10 initiative. Talk about that and talk about why you've launched this initiative and what it's doing and why it's trying to shift the approach to young people in churches.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I would say if I had to name 3 adjectives to describe this generation, and we at the Full Youth Institute spent some time doing this, this generation is anxious, as we've talked about a little bit already with mental health. They are adaptive, they are creative, they are entrepreneurial, and this generation is diverse. Just if we look at ethnicity and culture, in 2020, we crossed a line in the US in the midst of everything else that happened in 2020. Yeah. In 2020, we crossed a line where now 50% of those under 18 are young people of color. So it's just super exciting that this is the most ethnically diverse generation our nation in the U.S. has ever seen.
Well, it explains why one of the top 5 attitudes that would turn people off was racial attitudes.
Totally.
That explains it, right? That's because this is a diverse generation themselves, and their friend networks and their relational networks and also their cultural cues are all about racial diversity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so if this is the anxious, adaptive, and diverse generation that we know it is, what if we could be the most empathetic church that they've ever experienced? A church that doesn't judge them, but really journeys with them. And as we talked about earlier, young people are actually open to adult relationships. And so about 5 years ago, even before the pandemic, a number of denominations and youth-focused organizations started dreaming about what could God do if we work together. The reality, Curtis, is any organization or denomination working on its own, at best, will see a 10% change in young people, 10% more hope, 10% closer to the gospel, et cetera. If we want to see a 10x change, if we want to see a multiplicative change, then I think we need to do what Jesus prayed for in John 17, that we would be a unified church. And so for the last 4 or 5 years, 10 by 10 has been building relationships, building support, listening to young people, to youth leaders, and to partnering organizations. And we just launched on October 10th, 2023, as a national collaborative where the mission is to help faith matter more for 10 million young people in the next 10 years in the spirit of John 10:10. And so in the midst of this anxious, adaptive, diverse generation, we want them to see the abundant life that Jesus talks about in John 10:10 is their best answer. And so 10 by 10 is all about equipping leaders and reimagining youth discipleship and changing every church that wants to grow closer to young people.
And what is the vision for this reimagination?
Yeah. You hinted at it a little bit earlier. You said something really profound, Curtis, and I don't know if you realize how profound you said. Before our break,
please tell me. I'd love to be told how profound I am.
Yes. Here's some of just one of the amazingly wise things you've said so far, Curtis. You talked about how when we do programs, we usually do programs, I think you said for young people.
And two.
Yes, exactly. And, that's one of the fundamental shifts that we want to see churches make, is it's not about doing something for or to young people. It's about doing something with and by young people. Okay. It's about handing the keys over to them. And so, one of the very first exercises we walk churches through in the midst of our 10 by 10 training is actually listen to your young people. What are their losses? What are their longings? So many churches come to us and they have all sorts of ideas about what they can do for, teenagers, college students, or young adults. Yeah. And then we ask them, well, have you talked to your teenagers, college students, or young adults? And the answer is, actually not much. And so, that's honestly step one in showing empathy and rebuilding trust. I mean, this is one of the 5 things you named before the break, Curtis, is can we really listen to young people? And so that's what 10 by 10 starts with, is listening to young people.
So that's threatening, I think. I'm a former senior pastor.
Yeah.
I'm just going to tell you that is threatening because they will, if you really listen, and listen not with a sort of a pre-scripted kind of out conclusion that you're looking for, but I mean, really listen and really put your guard down, they'll tell you stuff that is hard to hear. And so that's threatening to just be to hear, like, hey, we think you're this, we think you're this, we don't see you're relevant. Like, so that's hard. One thing that's threatening. And then two, if you're going to do something with what you listen, like you're going to actually turn the keys over and let them design or at least co-design what needs to happen in a real way, that's giving up control. That's giving up control. So speak to church leaders about both of those things, about being willing to hear hard truth, but secondly, especially giving up control.
Well, on the first point about being willing to hear hard truth, like, young people are thinking it anyway.
Right, exactly.
So wouldn't we rather hear what they wish was different about our church, about our faith community, about our parish, than not? They're thinking it anyway. They're probably voting with their feet by not being part. And so, I would say this is just an overall question about leadership is, are we really open to continuous improvement, to constantly hearing from people and making sure that we're open to that feedback? Max Dupree, former Fuller trustee, has a great phrase: the first job of leaders is to define reality. And I think to understand reality, we need to do a lot of listening. And so, see, I've seen senior pastors and leaders do this in different ways. They might have the same few young people they take out to coffee. My previous church, my senior pastor did something interesting. He periodically invited young people to be part of the sermon prep meeting that he had every week.
That's fascinating.
So that he was hearing, whatever passage he was working on for usually 12 days ahead. It was Tuesday for, the following Sunday. He could hear young people's questions and perspective. So, it's how do we, whether it's taking young people out to coffee, whether it's inviting them to speak into our sermon, whether it's inviting young people to tell us what they think of our social media or our website presence. And let me just tell you, they will have opinions about that. They certainly will. I mean, my own kids critique me and my social media. So I know, Mom,
painful.
Your posts are too
That's
long.
Painful.
My posts are too long. That's what they always say. So, it starts with saying the next generation is worth hearing some hard truths, and for us as leaders to get to that point. In terms of giving up control, I actually think this is probably harder for most leaders. Is once we've listened, are we really willing to change? And I think, Heifetz talks about technical change versus adaptive change. Right. And so let's just say that.
Well, let's define those terms for
I was just going to. So technical change is where a small tweak, really a change in a program can make a difference. Adaptive change is when it's culture that needs to change. And so for most churches, it's in faith communities, it's really adaptive change that we need to consider. And so, let's imagine that a church wanted to move more into intergenerational relationships. Well, if it was only technical change, then you might say, gosh, if we changed the start of our worship service from 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock so that young people had an extra hour to sleep in, then they would start coming. That's a technical change solution. Maybe that needs to happen, but generally with churches, it's not just about changing the start time. It's not just about a 25-minute sermon instead of a 35-minute sermon. It's about a culture where young people are a priority. And this is what we're constantly saying to senior pastors: is can one of your ideally top 3, but if not top 3, top 5 priorities be young people? Where as you're imagining a sermon series, as you're imagining Lent, Advent, summer missions, whatever it might be, your giving strategy, your community outreach, one of your first questions is, how are young people involved? That is the kind of adaptive change that most churches need to make. And that does require giving up control. And again, the next generation is worth it. Most churches are shrinking and aging. And so if we care about the future of young people, I'll say the future of all people,
Yeah.
then it's an adaptive question for us. Are we
Yeah.
willing to make that change and give up control?
Kara, let's just whiteboard this for a moment
Yeah,
about
for sure.
possible adaptive changes and what that could look like. I'm not saying any of these are good ideas,
Yeah.
but let's just whiteboard this. So you gave one example of, hey, how about the senior pastor include a young person or young
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
in their sermon prep process?
Yeah.
Another that I heard is, how about if the senior pastor regularly takes out a kind of a kitchen cabinet, so a circle of young people,
Right. Sure.
that, every couple months they're having lunch and hearing from them directly. Let's just keep brainstorming. Like, what would you say about having young people serve on the elders, as in the elders? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a lot of churches do that. I shouldn't say a lot. We've had some churches do that. We generally recommend it be at least 2 young people, because being the sole young person in that kind of setting can be intimidating. But and some churches prefer like post 18, which is fine. Maybe it's not appropriate for a 15-year-old to be involved in the ins and outs of every aspect of church leadership. But I mean, to your point, a couple thoughts, Curtis. Number one, we actually on 1010.org, we partnered with the Barna Group to actually create a resource for any church leadership team, whether it's a pastoral team, an elder deacon team, or just a team of interested individuals, to think about how their church needs to change, and an actual process and a template for a 2 or 3 hour discussion. So I'd highly encourage leaders to visit 1010.org. 1010.org is the easiest way to get to our website. And you can see these resources from Barna. We've also worked with Barna to develop a sermon series, 3 sermon outlines that a senior pastor can use. So check those out. If I was a senior pastor right now, I think what I would do is I would look around my pastoral team and I would ask each one of them, how are young people part of what you're doing? How are you prioritizing young people in your work? So that's
and what if they say, well, that's not my job description. I'm the adult spiritual formation director. I'm the small group pastor. I'm the worship pastor. What's the answer to that?
Response? I love that question, because the best thing for all of those areas is to involve young people.
Okay.
So, a lot of our research at the Full Youth Institute has been about how can churches change young people. But literally every time we ask that question, Curtis, the answers reveal how young people are changing churches in return. Okay. So for that worship pastor, my job is worship. What better way to enliven worship than to involve young people? For that adult discipleship pastor, you're right. Young adults are your focus, but how are you mobilizing your adults to invest in young people? How is an adult mentoring relationship with a young person part of your vision for adult discipleship? It's not just So I would say across
no, not only that. I was just gonna interject.
Ministry.
I was just gonna interject on the adult formation thing. Is most of the adults you are trying to form, one of their primary spiritual challenges as adults is parenting. Like, if they are parents, right?
For sure.
So you can, any adult formation ministry that is not addressing, at least for a big subsection of your adults, on how they are being formed as parents, is just missing the boat.
Out. Absolutely.
On what adults are going through.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. I was thinking mentoring in general, but thank you for zeroing in on parents. Same thing with grandparents. For grandparents who are listening, there's some really encouraging research on how involved grandparents are these days. As more and more parents are working, as technology helps grandparents and grandkids stay more in touch across the country, grandparents are investing more in their own grandkids, whether that's after school pickups, whether that's a weekly Zoom call. And then let me just say, I love, and I actually find myself getting a little emotional when I say this, Curtis, I love one senior adult came to me a few years ago, and he said, I've been praying for God to bring mentors into my grandkids' lives who live across the country. I've been praying for God to bring mentors into their lives. And he said, what if I'm supposed to be another grandparent's answer to prayer with with their grandkid in my church.
Wow. Okay.
And I just feel like, yes. And there's a special tenderness we see for senior adults listening. Teenagers, children, college students, they're especially open to you and your wisdom. There's just a special tenderness between that third and
Yeah.
that first third of life and relationships. So there's a lot of doors opening for senior adults.
Can I just tell us? I got to tell a personal story on that front. So when our eldest daughter, who was in college at that time, she was a sophomore in college during when the pandemic hit, and so the pandemic hit, Michigan shut down, and you know where she went? She did not come home right away as her first. She went to her grandma, and they spent the first several months and the pandemic together, both because I think the grandmother was alone, but also I think she needed a special kind of comfort and care that was not the parent type. I mean, we were talking. It wasn't like we were in a relationship, but she wanted to be with her grandma. And they would spend and I think she sensed that her grandma would have time for her in a way that we did not have time for her during the day. So they would spend their days. They both loved knitting. They would, like two old souls on armchairs knitting the whole day. She would go do her homework, and they would come out and knit, and they would cook together. And I couldn't do that. I couldn't provide that kind of daily experience for her. And she, I think, instinctively knew she needed that level of investment. And it was the sweetest thing for me to witness, to know that she was in that trusted relationship. And I think to wholeheartedly say we need to recognize the gift we have in our older population, that they have a role to play with our youth.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of times senior adults are looking for a sense of meaning and purpose, especially post-retirement. Like you said, there's more time. Then what better way than to invest in the generation, whether it's your actual grandchild or somebody who feels like a grandchild to you, an adopted grandchild, so to speak. So and there's a lot of youth ministries that have amazing senior adult volunteers. For our new book, Faith Beyond Youth Group, one of the youth leaders we profile, and we've gotten permission to share his name, is 71 years old, and his name is Slick. And Slick, or his nickname is Slick, the whole church calls him Slick. And he's been a volunteer in the junior high ministry. Yeah. And before the pandemic, the church is right across the street from McDonald's. And so junior hires used to go after church to hang out in the McDonald's, get a sub, a sundae, a drink, fries, whatever, and wait for parents to come pick them up. Pandemic hits, McDonald's closes. McDonald's ends up open to drive-through. Slick, at age 71, buys a used limo so he could fill the back seat with middle schoolers and take them through the McDonald's drive-in.
That's awesome.
And give them that experience. And Slick is beloved and a volunteer. So yes, there's all sorts of ways for senior adults to invest in young people.
Kara, for this last segment, I want to get like a little spicy here.
Oh, good. Okay. Ready for that.
And I want to offer a hot take for me that I've been thinking a lot about, and I want to see what you think about this in terms of youth ministry. And I want to start with your tagline that's on your website for 10 by 10, and I think I love the sentiment here. It says we need to invest in people, not just programs. The church is built by deeper relationships. Okay, so relationships over program. That seems to me to be the spiritual heart of your 10 by 10 vision.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we make this about relationships, not programs? Because that's what this next generation is looking for, is open to and hungry for relationships, not programs. Okay, here's my hot take. I think as a church, we have a business model that almost makes that you are fighting against a tidal wave to make that shift. And here's why. Because we have a professional church model. We have a model in which there are professionals we hire that have to then justify their salary. And we're affiliated with Fuller. That's our business model. We are training youth professionals. So the moment you have a professional that's responsible for youth ministry, how does that professional think? I've been that kind of professional. I know how they think. They think I've got to build a scale of users that are contributing units, right? So for youth ministers, it's families.
Yeah.
So I've got to build enough families with youth benefiting from my ministry
Yeah.
with enough scale to justify my salary, and ideally an associate youth minister, because that makes my
Right.
life even easier. Right.
Right.
So that means I've got to get a user base of something like 30, 40 families. And if I want an associate, that's probably doubling that. So how do you build that scale? The business model that gets you quickest to that scale is programs. It just is.
Yeah.
Is you run a program, because I cannot have relationships with that many youth myself, and it's a lot of work to try to build a ministry that is that relationally intense that 30, 40, or 60 to 80 youth are going to have that level of relationship. So I'm going to scale a program, and that then rewards a certain type of professional who's a program builder, who's charismatic, who basically replicate what evangelical churches have done with adult ministries, which is we look for the charismatic person who can build an event, a flashy event that is programmatic in nature, that builds a big user base quickly. So, okay, that's my hot take. Tell me where I'm wrong in this.
Whew, I don't think you're wrong. I think you're absolutely right, Curtis. And we actually address this in our 10 by 10 training head on.
Okay.
We talk about purpose, people, program. Because depending on how you define program, I mean, programs aren't inherently bad, right? Okay. I mean, a program is a gathering. It's a structured time, either with peers or intergenerational. Those can be really good, right? It's just that it needs to, first of all, start with your purpose. And so this is our first invitation to youth leaders, is why are you doing what you do? What has God called you to do in and through young people? And let's name that. Let's make it overt. We encourage leaders to write it on their whiteboard, make it part of every meeting. Let's remind ourselves of our purpose. Then secondly, it's about the people, not the people in your ministry now, not the people who were in your ministry 5 years ago, not, I think even more commonly, your own ministry experience, say as a teenager. I think a lot of youth pastors are replicating the ministry experience they had as a teenager. But no, it's about the young people in your community, in your church, the adults who are connected with those young people. Let's understand, and in particular, we encourage leaders to really probe questions about identity, belonging, and purpose. And so what can you learn about your people's identity, belonging, and purpose? And 10 by 10 spells out how to do that more completely. And then once you understand your why and your who, then you get into your how, which is the program. And so, you probably do want to meet regularly. That's a good thing if it flows from your purpose and your people. So I don't have anything inherently against program if it flows in the logical order. What tends to happen, though, is that we start with program. We start with what we've done, what we've always done in the past. We start with what we want to do. And that becomes first chair instead of the purpose and then the people being first and second chair.
Yeah. Okay. I think it absolutely is the right move towards programs that are designed for relationships, right? Programs that are trying to foster relationships.
Totally.
But I want to highlight a risk that I think has to be on people's minds as we prioritize relationship. And that is the issue of abuse. Because we are seeing this come out in just every denomination. I mean, obviously we've seen it in the Catholic Church for decades now, but it's clear that it is not a Catholic problem. It is a church problem. Whenever my good friend, colleague Nancy French has been investigating the Kanakuk abuse, both abuse and cover up of that. That issue has touched my life personally as well. It is prevalent. And the reason it is, I think, is because most churches don't have categories for detecting the ways in which abuse can creep into relationships, right? I mean, there's the obvious cases of, sexual abuse or physical abuse, but the nature of youth formation is such that I think there is so much danger for emotional, psychological abuse, because adults don't realize the ways that youth brains and spirits and brains are formed such that they are very vulnerable to even subtle moves of when you have an in-group versus an out-group, versus shaming, versus
Yeah.
subtle manipulation and control towards guilt, moves of guilt to
Whew.
get them to attend your programs. And adults just, so how do we address that? We have to get into relationships, but we get into relationships and then we get into a very difficult area where youth can be abused in those relationships.
Yeah. Well, now you're getting even spicier, Curtis. You're getting even more challenging. I mean, first thing I would say is the good news is there are really wonderful, reputable organizations that can help a church come up with the right policies to prevent and respond to the kind of sexual, physical abuse that you started by talking about, Curtis. And so, every church absolutely needs to do that. If you're a youth leader and you don't know if your church is doing that, talk to your supervisor, make sure that your church has those policies, et cetera, and that you're following them yourself as well as having your volunteers follow. So that's the good news. What you're talking about, though, is much more subtle. And I think this is where it requires community to be able to ascertain, are we slipping into some kind of power abuse, some kind of emotional manipulation? Because any one person might not even realize that they're slipping into it, but when you talk with other volunteers, if you're a pastor and talk to another pastor colleague at your church or another church, and share some of what's happening, that's when they can say, that I'm feeling like that's a little pink flaggish. That's a little. It's maybe not a red flag, but it's on the way to being a red flag, and we need to address that. So this is where being transparent, and I think when you're starting to keep things secret, that's a really bad sign. Okay, right. So being transparent. If there's anything you feel like you couldn't share with others, also a bad sign. So being transparent and being in community with people that you've invited or feel comfortable, calling out any potential areas of abuse. I mean, I think that's, in addition to the organizations who can help us structurally and with policy, I think that relational support and accountability is our next best response.
I think that is quite congruent with what we're saying is part of just effective youth ministry. It's having multiple channels, multiple listening ears into the youth experience. It's most dangerous when you just are trusting one person to tell you what is happening in the youth, and that person happens to have certain incentives in place of getting numbers to show up or whatever, right? Which is your youth minister is who I'm talking about, which is, again, trust your youth minister, but also build your own relationship with trust. That's why the senior pastor should have their own independent direct lines of relationships, where elders should have representatives from youth, where parents should be actively engaged, listening and sharing about what's happening in youth experiences, such that it's not just delegated to the professional to tell you, here's what's happening with the youth.
And I think, Curtis, you were once again profound, and maybe didn't even realize how profound you were when you talked about metrics. And when you talked about the attendance numbers, and I think that we haven't talked about that yet in this conversation, but
go for it. I think that's absolutely critical.
That's super important. And I don't have anything against attendance as a metric. Feel free to keep tracking that. There is something that tells us. And I don't think spiritual formation boils down to a kid being able to sit for 75 minutes, either on Zoom or in person, right? That's not spiritual formation. So what we recommend across the board to youth leaders is track attendance and suggest to your church or your supervisor other metrics that are more relational. What kind of contact are your volunteers having with young people? What kind of, how known do young people feel by adults in the church? How many adults in the church can name 5 young people in the church? There's all sorts of creative, all sorts of creative metrics.
One that they should ask a youth, for your last athletic event, your sporting event, or your art or your theater production, did any adult, maybe other than your parents from the church, show up for that?
Absolutely. That because that's the kind of meaningful support that's connected with discipleship ultimately. Similarly with parents, how engaged are parents? How are volunteers, small group leaders getting to know parents? How are young people involved in service? not just sitting on Sunday mornings through church, but how are they involved in making a difference locally and globally? So yes, let's go ahead and do attendance, but please add 2 or 3 other metrics that you're tracking.
And attendance is probably going to be the least actually predictive of
Indicative,
true spiritual
yes,
formation.
absolutely.
It seems to me, I mean, if you're really serious, if as you said, you start with purpose, if your purpose that you've defined as a church and as a youth ministry is deep, lifelong spiritual formation into a follower of Jesus, a key metric is, where are they 5 years after they've left? They've left, like, you should be doing longitudinal follow-up with all of your youth. I mean, I think the church's youth ministries tend to be like, well, once they're off in college, it's like, well, my hands are, I'm done. You know, a few of them will maybe occasionally keep track, but there should be a systematic, like, hey, where are they now? Where are they now? Kind of prism to all of it.
And you know, I gotta say, I love the 5 years. I mean, the researcher in me applauds that. And like, even 3 months later, 6 months later, like,
we'll start there. We'll take that.
Literally, where are they at Christmas? Are they connected with the faith community at Christmas after they graduate? And because I think that's usually pretty telling of whether or not they'll get connected in the next year or two. So.
Kara, this has been a fascinating, energetic, meaningful, sobering, but also encouraging conversation. I love that you're an optimist, because we need optimism, we need hope. And I think you're right. There is hope, because this generation is actually, all the surveys show, they want relationships. They're hungry for relationships. That would make a difference. Everybody can offer that. Everybody can offer that. Does not take charisma. It does not take skill. It does not take budget. It just takes willingness and love, right? So Kara, thank you for bringing this message. Any final plug you want to give for 10 by 10? How can people get involved? How can church leaders get involved? What should they be doing?
Yeah, well, the great thing about 10 by 10 is it's for evangelical, mainline, Catholic, Orthodox leaders and churches. So no matter who you are, go to 1010.org. And you can start getting free updates. Most of our resources are free. The vast majority of our resources for both youth leaders and senior pastors are free. And this can jumpstart you toward more meaningful discipleship with young people. So yes, please do check out the website and sign up for our updates.
Okay, and I have one invitation to our listeners for Good Faith. We've been talking so much about the move to invite, as parents, to invite your youth into what you are thinking, what you are doing. Give them a window. Here's a very practical thing you can do. If you've listened to this podcast and you've thought, hey, I really need to take this into heart. Let me offer an invitation for you listeners, is actually ask your youth to listen to this podcast and then have a conversation.
Love it.
Was Kara right? What did Kara get? What did Kara get right?
Let them critique
What did they get wrong?
For
yes,
sure.
What did we get wrong? What did we miss? What have we misstated? Like, open it up for us to be for inquiry, and then also share, like, hey, when Kara said this, I wondered, maybe I've been pulling back and giving you too much space in the sense of not actually being interested. Like ask them these questions, right? And if you feel like you can't just barge in with a conversation like this because you're going from 0 to 60, use something like that. If not this podcast, something else. That's like, I'm reading this, I'm listening to this. Here, can you listen to it and tell me what you think? That's a very easy invitation to make. So
great. Love it.
Well, Kara, thank you again for joining us. And to listeners, thank you for joining us. And we will next week once again gather around the campfire.